The West assured Ukraine that a road to victory existed. Today, Ukraine finds itself encircled, its cities battered, its leadership pleading for terms that Moscow has no intention of offering. This outcome should not surprise anyone who understands how power politics works. What we are witnessing is what happens when major powers collide and a smaller state becomes the arena for competing ambitions. Think of it this way. One powerful actor steadily pushes its influence right up to the doorstep of another powerful actor. The second repeatedly warns that this is unacceptable. The warnings are ignored. Alliances expand, partners are recruited, and the pressure continues. Eventually, the second actor strikes back forcefully, and suddenly the response is labeled shocking, unprovoked, or evil. Yet anyone familiar with basic strategic logic could have predicted this reaction long before it happened. That is where things stand now. Ukrainian forces are trapped, infrastructure is devastated, and President Volodymyr Zelensky is calling for a ceasefire. Moscow refuses, not out of inherent cruelty, but because the strategic reasons that led Russia into this war remain intact and, from its perspective, have been validated. This conflict did not erupt out of nowhere. Years ago, it was argued that Western policy was guiding Ukraine toward disaster, encouraging NATO expansion, deeper EU integration, and a decisive geopolitical shift was always likely to provoke a violent reaction from Russia. This was not about admiration for Moscow or approval of its behavior. It was about understanding how great powers behave. Historically, they do not tolerate hostile military alliances on their borders. The United States' reaction to Soviet missiles in Cuba and its long enforcement of the Monroe Doctrine in Latin America illustrate the same logic. Western policymakers convinced themselves that such realities no longer applied, that liberal values and institutional expansion had replaced spheres of influence. They believed Russia would ultimately accept NATO moving ever closer to its borders. That belief was profoundly mistaken, and Ukraine is bearing the consequences. Yet understanding Russia's behavior requires seeing the world as Russian strategists do, not through Western moral narratives. From Moscow's viewpoint, NATO's advance toward Ukraine represents a direct threat to its security. Geography matters. History matters. Russia remembers invasions from the West by Napoleon Bonaparte and by Adolf Hitler and the staggering losses that followed. Expecting Russia to ignore these fears was never realistic. Ukraine trusted Western assurances. Its leaders believed alignment with the West would guarantee protection. They were led to think that sovereignty and democratic aspirations would be backed by force if necessary. But great powers do not fight major wars for ideals alone. They fight for interests. Ukraine, tragically, is not a vital interest for the United States or for Europe. Arms, sanctions, and speeches were always on the table. Direct war with Russia was not. Now, with Ukrainian forces under immense pressure and Western enthusiasm fading, Russia sees no incentive to halt its campaign. Wars end when the objectives of the stronger side are satisfied. Russia's goals to Ukrainian neutrality and a halt to NATO expansion remain unmet. From Moscow's perspective, stopping now would make little sense. Sanctions have hurt, but Russia has adapted, redirecting trade toward China, India, and much of the global south. Europe faces rising energy costs, inflation strains public support, and Washington's attention is increasingly divided. Time favors Russia, not Ukraine. This assessment may sound harsh, but realism often does. Ukraine's suffering is undeniable, and the war should never have occurred. Yet wishing cannot undo strategic miscalculations. Western leaders assumed they could reshape Eastern Europe without triggering a violent response. They were wrong, and Ukrainians are paying with their lives. The deeper lesson extends beyond Ukraine. The international system has no central authority to enforce rules or protect weaker states. Power still matters. Great powers secure their interests, and smaller states are often caught in between. Values and ideals influence rhetoric, but when survival and security are at stake, interests prevail. What comes next is grimly predictable. Russia will continue pressing its advantage until Ukraine accepts harsh terms or Western governments push Kyiv to do so. Those terms will likely include territorial losses, enforced neutrality, and the effective end of NATO's eastern expansion. Ukraine may ultimately emerge worse off than if neutrality had been negotiated years earlier. For years, The public was told Ukraine was winning and Russia was on the verge of collapse. These claims were comforting but false. The encirclement of Ukrainian forces is not just a military development. It is a political reckoning. Reality has collided with narrative. This war was not inevitable because of Ukraine's choices alone, but because of a broader failure to respect the enduring rules of power politics. Ideology was prioritized over prudence, expansion over stability. The result is a devastated country, a prolonged war, and a tragic reminder that in international affairs, power dynamics often outweigh aspirations. Ukraine today is desperate, isolated, and facing the consequences of promises that could not be fulfilled. That is not an opinion. It is the situation as it stands.